Hey, welcome to Candid Conversation. We're going to cover Psalm 48, the entire chapter in this one. I've entitled this Rebellion and God's Eternal Kingdom. What you've got in the first two verses, it talks about Mount Zion when God's eternal kingdom is on earth. And then for the rest of the chapter, it talks about the rebellion that is in the kingdom. I think a lot of people don't understand this. I think most people, you think of, okay, when Satan is cast into the bottomless pit, and then after that he is destroyed. The Antichrist and his forces destroyed. When everything is done, reconciled back to Christ, Ephesians 1:10, the dispensation of the fullness of times, everything is gathered together in one in Christ. That it's just blissful joy, and there's no sin. It's like a continual, eternal existence where there's whoever is there. They live eternally. There's no one added. There's no one subtracted, and there's no sin. And we're just in the presence of God, and everything is joy, 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 joy. That's what most people, I think of, and the Bible, though, paints a different picture, and churchianity doesn't tell you about that. So we're going to get into that in Psalm 48. Psalm 48, Great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised, in the city of our God, in the mountain of His holiness. Beautiful for situation, the joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion on the sides of the north, the city of the great King. Notice it's the city of our God. City of our God, that is New Jerusalem. That's New Jerusalem. We'll go over to Revelation 21 in a minute, because that's where it's described. You've got Mount Zion. You notice in verse 2, the joy of the whole earth. Joy of the whole earth. So that shows you that this is God's kingdom on earth. When you are in Psalms, you don't know yet about the mystery of given to Paul, starting in Acts chapter 9, and so all the focus is on the earth. But what's going to happen in that time, if you go over to John chapter 1, I mentioned Ephesians 1:10, the dispensation of the fullness of times. So Ephesians 1:10, dispensation, fullness of times. That's where all is gathered together in one in Christ. Well, in John 1:51, it tells you how it's going to work. John 1:51. In John 1:51, it says, He saith unto him, Verily, verily, I say unto you, this is Jesus talking, Hereafter ye shall see heaven open, and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. So the Son of Man is Jesus. So He is in Mount Zion on the earth, because the angels are ascending and descending upon Him. So He's on the earth, heaven is above, so these angels ascend from the Son of Man, and then they descend down, and the reason is because you see heaven open. So you've got, that's where the body of Christ is. So the way it works in the dispensation of the fullness of times is you've got the body of Christ in heaven. Heaven, body of Christ up here. And then you've got the Son of Man. So we're just making like this. This is Jesus on earth. Then you've got Israel. Israel is the bride of Christ. The bride of Christ, they're on earth with Jesus. They are one with Him. Of course, we are one with Him as well. And He is our head. And so here you've got the neck of Jesus, and you've got angels, because angels are going to work. They're ministers for those who would be heirs of salvation, Hebrews 1:14. So they need to minister for us in heavenly places, but they also need to minister for Israel down on the earth. So in the dispensation of the fullness of times, you've got Jesus on the earth, and that's where this is. Of course, In Psalm 48, we don't know anything about the heaven yet. That's still a mystery hidden in God until revealed to Paul in Acts 9. So you got Jesus on earth, you've got heaven open there, the body of Christ is up there, angels ascending and descending upon Jesus. Israel is the bride of Christ with Jesus, and so that's the neck there. So that is dispensation of the fullness of times, basically how it works. So getting back to Psalm 48 now, so you've got here, I mentioned New Jerusalem. So it says, it is this, in verse 1, is the city of our God. If you go to Revelation 21, in Revelation chapter 21, it says in verse 1, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there is no more sea. By the way, keep a bookmark in Revelation 21, because we'll be going back there as we go through Psalm 48. Verse 2, John saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. So that's Israel, bride of Christ. You notice it's New Jerusalem there. You go to verse 10, or look at verse 9. There came unto me one of the 7 angels, which had the 7 vials full of the 7 last plagues, and talked with me, saying, Come hither, I will show thee the bride, the Lamb's wife. And he carried me away in the spirit to a great and high mountain, and showed me that great city, the holy Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God. So Revelation 21, 9 and 10 shows that Israel, the bride, is a city. New Jerusalem, it's a city, that great city. It's the city of our God in Psalm 48, verse 1. And so what that tells you then is Jesus is married to a city. Now, I know he's not really literally married to walls and streets and that type of stuff. He's married to the people, the bride, but the bride is the city. We in Ephesians 2 are the habitation of God. We're the temple of God in heavenly places. But this also tells you why I think that Satan corrupts the city. Because God's plan is for his son Jesus to marry a city. And so when Satan is able to get with the rebellion, he gets Cain to kill Abel. And then the next thing you see him doing is building a city. In Genesis chapter 4 and verse 17, Cain knew his wife, she conceived and bare Enoch, and he builded a city, and called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch. So in Genesis 4:17, Cain builds city, names after his son. And what does God have? God has Jesus, his son, marry a city. Israel, the bride. So I'm sure it's not a coincidence here that the city that Cain built, he named it after his son. That's not a coincidence. Because God builds a city, the city of our God, which is the bride of Christ, Israel, and Jesus is going to marry that city, and so the two become one in marriage. So you might as well say that the city that God built, New Jerusalem, is also named Jesus, the name of God's son, Jesus. Just like the city that Cain built is named after his son Enoch. By the way, this is a different Enoch from the one who was raptured up and walked with God. So it's just interesting there. And then you notice when you get past Noah in the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11, then what they're doing there is they're building a city. In verse 4, Go to, let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven. So you got the city, we call it the Tower of Babel, which I mean is really what they're doing there, but they also want to build a city to reach into heaven. The idea there is to take God off of the throne and install Satan on the throne. So you see how Satan uses the city. God's going to have his son marry a city, New Jerusalem, and Satan has Cain build a city, naming it after his son, and then he tries to use a city to reach into heaven and the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11 to take God off of the throne. And so it's not a coincidence that you look at today, really the corrupt, if you look at the U.S., and I talk about this in my Sex and Marriage book, and I go through a history, the big downfall of the U.S. started when the majority of the people were in the city. Because the thing about living in the country is, you live in the country, the unit is a family. So your parents raise you up, and so out there in the country, things didn't change much. I mean, the ground is still the ground. You still have animals and crops just the same. Those things don't change. Maybe technology, but for the most part, it's still the same. Family, you've got parents raising their own kids, teaching their own kids, and they would teach them the values of God's Word. They would go to church and spend the whole day at church, really, every Sunday. And so the whole thing was revolved around family, traditional values, and God and His Word. And that's how it was until you get to the early 1900s, when for the first time, the 1920s, the majority of people in the U.S. now lived in a city. And the thing about a city is the unit isn't the family, the unit is the company, the corporation you work for. And you had division of labor. So then you got all these prostitutes started. You got all this debauchery that happens with the city. And I won't go into all that because that's not the purpose of our discussion today. But the city just makes everything worse. And so then you see all these changing values as you get away from the traditions of the country and the family and the farm. You get away from the simple life, you get into the pleasures of this world, and sin is never satisfied, so it just gets worse and worse and worse. And that all started, that started before in the late 1800s, I guess, but really in 1920 it's called the Roaring Twenties, because then that's where a lot of people moved into that city environment, and the country was corrupted. And here we are 100 years later, and look at what it's done. Whereas you look at 100 years in the country, things don't change that much. So you can see how today, I don't live in a city. Well, I mean, it's technically a city. When I moved here, it was a little over 1,000 people, and now we're over 3,000. So it was a town, and over 3,000 means you're a city now, but it's still not, it's not a big city, let's say. Farmland around me, and of course they're starting to build houses. But anyway, so you've got, but today you look at where the corruption, the crime is, all the bad stuff. Certainly it happens in the country too. There's a lot of people in the country addicted to drugs. That's a big problem wherever you go. But for the most part, you have traditional values. You have people going to church. You don't have the big crime, and everything really happens in the big cities. That's this places you want to avoid. So it's just interesting that God is going to Jesus is going to marry a city, Israel, and then when Satan, knowing that, uses the city as a place of rebellion. So, okay, going back to then where we are here in Psalm 48. So you see, great is the Lord, greatly to be praised in the city of our God, the mountain of His holiness, beautiful for situation. The joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion, on the sides of the north, the city of the great King. So sides of the north. That shows this is, if you're on the sides of the north, you can't get any higher. This is the place where God rules. The possessor of heaven and earth is on the sides of the north. If you look in Isaiah 14, when Lucifer wanted to rebel against God in Isaiah 14. You look over there in Isaiah 14. Isaiah 14, and he says in verse 13, Lucifer says in his heart, Thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. You want to know what the mount of the congregation is? Mount Zion. He says, I'm going to sit in the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north, and that's where God sits. He sits on the Mount Zion in the sides of the north. So you can see here Satan's plan to rebel, and then God's, of course, puts it down. Okay, so now Go back to Psalm 48, verse 2. Beautiful for situation, the joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion on the sides of the north, the city of the great king. So verse 1 says, city of our God. And then verse 2 says, city of the great king. Well, you know that's Jesus. So right there, it teaches you that Jesus is both God and man. Because it is the city of our God, but it's also the city of our great king. And he came as the king of Israel. And there in the book of Matthew shows Jesus as king. Okay, now verse 3. God is known in her palaces for a refuge. Well, that's interesting. Remember the typical view of eternity, God's eternal kingdom, is there is no sin. There's no problems on the earth. So the question is, why is God known for a place of refuge? Place of refuge. Refuge implies problems. If I'm like, I know when we've gone to Memphis for the quartet show for a few years, and I don't ever stay in Memphis. There's a lot of high crime there and everything. The shows are there, but I just sort of, I go outside. I actually stay over the Mississippi River over in Arkansas. I go across the river to get, it's sort of like, you could say that, not that that's the safest place in the world, but it's better than being in the big city where a lot of crime is. And so it's safer over there. So it's like my place, I go to the concerts in Memphis, but then at night, my place of refuge is Arkansas. I go across the Mississippi River. Well, you only need a place of refuge if there's problems. So the fact that it says God is known in her palaces for a refuge shows you that outside of New Jerusalem, in God's eternal kingdom, there are problems. So let's talk a little bit about that, because most people don't even recognize that. They just assume everything's fine, no sin, everybody serves the Lord, and that's it. And certainly in New Jerusalem that is the case, but outside in the Gentiles, it's a whole different world out there. So let's talk about that. Go over to Psalm chapter 2. Psalm chapter 2. In Psalm chapter 2, you're talking about that millennial reign. Verse 7, thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee. Verse 8, ask of me, God says to the Son, and I shall give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession. So he's going to have God's kingdom on earth in New Jerusalem, in Israel, but then he also possesses the Gentiles. And so, but you notice what's happening with them. Verse 9, thou shalt break them with a rod of iron, which is the law. Thou shalt dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. There's problems if you got to do that. If you're ruling, if you're ruling and you're punishing people with a rod of iron and dashing them in pieces like a potter's vessel, you're breaking them up. It's showing their sin. There's problems that he has to use a rod of iron. If you have a kid, you don't use a rod on him unless he's misbehaving. You don't treat him, you don't punish him unless he's doing something wrong. So the fact that Jesus is breaking the Gentiles with a rod of iron shows there. So Jesus, Psalm 2:9, Jesus uses a rod of iron on the nations. What does that mean? It means they have sin. Or else why wouldn't he do that? Verse 10, be wise now therefore, O ye kings, be instructed ye judges of the earth. Serve the Lord of fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son lest he be angry and ye perish from the way, when his wrath is kindled but a little. Blessed are all they that put their trust in him. This is not talking about today. It's not talking about Jesus' second coming. He's already sitting on the throne. You see in verse 6, I have set my king upon my holy hill of Zion. So we're talking about the kingdom here. New Jerusalem, God's kingdom on earth, Mount Zion, on the sides of the north. And he has the Gentiles, and his wrath, he says in verse 12, kiss the Son lest he be angry and ye perish from the way, when his wrath is kindled but a little. So you see Jesus ruling with a rod of iron. Verse 12, Jesus punishing the nations. And these things happen in God's kingdom on earth. He's already, in verse 6, sitting on the holy hill of Zion. So you see there is a rebellion there. Look in Zechariah chapter 8. Zechariah chapter 8. I'm just going to run a few verses to see. Here you've got, of course there's a rebellion, but you know not everybody is going to go along with that. There are people who want to serve the Lord, who recognize Jesus as the Lord, as the Savior. They recognize that they do sins and they want to be forgiven of their sins. And so Zechariah 8 verse 23, Israel is going to be a kingdom of priests to the nations in God's kingdom on earth. And Zechariah 8:23, thus saith the Lord of hosts, in those days it shall come to pass that 10 men shall take hold out of all languages of the nations, even shall take hold of the skirt of him that is a Jew, saying, we will go with you, for we have heard that God is with you. The implication of this is basically believing Gentiles saying to Jews, save us from these kings and basically the rebellion against Jesus. Save us from that rebellion. You see there in Psalm 48 verse 3, God is known in her palaces for a refuge. You know, I'm not going over to Arkansas to stay when the concerts are in Memphis if I don't need a place of refuge from what's going on in the city. If the city is a great city, you know, everything's fine, stay right there, you know. That's a lot more convenient. But I go over into Arkansas as a place of refuge away from the crime and all the bad stuff that happens in Memphis. So here are the people, they're believing Gentiles, but the kings and the nations are not serving God. And so they say, oh, there's a Jew. I know God is with him. God is protecting him. You know, he's got the glorified body. He's not sinning. And so I'm going to take hold. I'm not going to let him go because maybe he'll protect me against these other people who are sinning. And I'm going to go with you. I've heard God is with you. And so then when they go in, it's going to be a place of refuge. God is known in her palaces for a refuge. God is known in the palaces of New Jerusalem there as a place of refuge for these people who are believing, but yet the nations are in rebellion. Isaiah 2 verses 2 through 4, you see them, they're all excited now. They found a Jew. They're going up to Jerusalem. And they say in Isaiah 2:2, it says, verse 3, many people shall go and say, come ye, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us of his ways, we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So there, you see there in verse 3, they are going, why can't they find it in the Gentile nations? I mean, if everybody is serving Jesus Christ, and he's the one world ruler in Jerusalem, well then you just go to those who are in authority in whatever nation you're in and find out what God's word is and to follow it. But you see, there's a rebellion. So then the people have to say, well, we're going to go up to Jerusalem where the Lord is, and then we'll learn of his ways there. Verse 4, he shall judge among the nations and shall rebuke many people in God's kingdom on earth. He's judging and rebuking many people. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Well, that's because he's ruling with a rod of iron. They've got swords, they've got spears. They want to destroy Jesus and have their own rule, and they want to become powerful and build up their own nation. But Jesus isn't letting them do it. He's ruling with a rod of iron. He's breaking them into pieces, meaning to keep them from uniting, just like at the Tower of Babel, Genesis 11. Man united in his rebellion against God. And so God created nations, the 70 nations there. So when he uses the rod of iron to break them in pieces, it's breaking in pieces these national ties. United Nations, the European Union, you know, these different international bodies that are together what they're doing is they're uniting in the rebellion against God ultimately, because they're trying to overthrow that last check against the sin nature of nationalism. So if you've got a bunch of sinners there in God's kingdom on earth among the nations, one way that they will try to overthrow Jesus is to create united nations, to come together. And they figure together as one, maybe we can overthrow this tyrant Jesus who is in Jerusalem. But he's ruling with a rod of iron, and he breaks them in pieces. He keeps the nations apart. He keeps them from uniting. And so they can't do it. So they got to beat their swords into plowshares, spears into pruning hooks, and not lift up sword against nation, because it doesn't work. It's not successful because Jesus is so much more powerful than they are. So I hope you see this is quite a contrast in God's kingdom on earth versus what most people look at it as. Then you look in Zechariah 14. So that was Isaiah 2. That was Isaiah 2, 3, and 4. You see rebellion of the nations. That was Isaiah 2, 3, and 4. And then the next one is Zechariah 14. Zechariah 14, 16 through 19. Zechariah 14, the very end of the chapter there, verses 16, at the very end of the book, I should say, of Zechariah. Zechariah chapter 14, verses 16 through 19. Notice what happens in God's kingdom on earth, the rebellion that's there. And this is one of the ways he stops it. He breaks them into pieces. Well, how do you do it? The way you have life on this earth is really water. You don't have water, you die. You got to have water to live. So what he does is, Zechariah 14, verse 16, it shall come to pass that every one that is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem, so this was at Jesus' second coming under the Antichrist, the ones who were left, the ones who did not take the mark or worship the image of the beast, that are still left under that Antichrist rule. They're going to go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. Feast of Tabernacles for Israel, where they're in the Feast of Tabernacles is all about Israel stayed in. Think of tents. Tabernacles. Think of tents. And then for 40 years they wandered in the wilderness living in tents, because they're wandering for 40 years. They don't have a brick home they can stay in. You can't pick up a brick home and put it on your back and walk down the road. So you have a tent to stay in. And for 40 years in the wilderness, they stayed in these tents. And then they got into the promised land. And when they got in there, God says there were 7 feasts that he had them observe. But one of the feasts was a Feast of Tabernacles, where they would stay in a tent. Tabernacle being a tent for 7 days, to remind them of what, and they did this every year, to remind them of that they weren't in a land. They were wanderers, they were pilgrims, strangers. And so it's not a coincidence that Jesus says, you've got to go up to Jerusalem and put out a tent and stay in a tent for a week, to make you understand that that land that you're in, that I'm letting you stay in, the Gentiles, as I'm the king of the earth, and you're a Gentile in this land out here, it's not your land. You don't have a permanent place. Until you trust in me, then you don't have a permanent place to live. So this reminds you every year, come up to the Feast of Tabernacles, stay in a tent. And now, think of today. Well, you have that with the homeless in Los Angeles and some of these cities. But, most people wouldn't want to do that. Those are people who value drugs more than they value shelter. But most people, they have a nice house to stay in. If they don't own it, they rent it, and they like having the comforts of a home. Right now it's winter time. We're having lows of around freezing. You don't really want to be outside when it's freezing. And this is the warm part of the U.S. down in the south, the deep south. Most of the U.S., they probably got temperatures in the teens or zeros, or really, really cold. You don't want to be out there in that kind of weather. You also don't want to be out here in July and August when the heat index is 110 every day. So you want to shelter from that stuff. And so if you're in that time, you'd say, well, I don't want to go and live in a tent. I like my home. You know, that's for us, you know, a vacation is some luxurious thing, you know. Here it's the opposite. It's, oh, you're going to stay in a tent. Or you're going to go camping. Well, camping may be fun for kids, but when you're 60 years old, you probably don't want to lie on the dirt in a tent for a week. And so they say, well, you know, he's ruling with a rod of iron. He's dashing them in pieces. And one of the things he requires is 1 week a year, stay in a tent in Jerusalem. And some don't want to do it. Verse 17, it shall be that whoso will not come up of all the families of the earth into Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, even upon them shall be no rain. If the family of Egypt go not up, come not, they have no rain. There shall be the plague wherewith the Lord will smite the heathen that come not up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. This shall be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all nations that come not up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. So keep the feast, or no water for you. That's the rod of iron. What are you going to do then? You don't have any water. I know here we get 60 inches of rain per year where I am. One of the wettest places in the whole U.S. And if we go a few weeks without rain, they're already talking about drought, extreme drought conditions. Of course, it's not extreme drought. I look out there, there's all this water out there. But you know, they got to sensationalize everything. But they're already saying, oh, I think this year, last time I checked, we had 59 inches of rain, and our average is 64 in a year. So we're 5 inches below normal. They make it sound like a catastrophe, you know. Oh, what are you going to do? We only got 59 inches of rain this year. We normally have 64. Drought conditions, it's a drought. Well, we're not talking about that. We're talking about you normally get 40 inches of rain. 0. You get 0. What are you going to do now? How are you going to live? You don't have any water. I was also in Revelation 21, or Revelation 22, when it comes to the kingdom on earth. You've got them going up to Jerusalem. In Revelation 22, verse 1, he showed me a pure river of water of life, clear as crystal, proceeding out of the throne of God and of the Lamb. By the way, you remember when Joseph was in Egypt and he was ruling there in Genesis, and there was a famine in the land. So Jacob tells, or his sons say, hey, we got to go up here we got to go to Egypt and get some food. So what do you think is going to happen if you're a believing Gentile and you're in a nation that doesn't have any water because they didn't keep the feast? Well, you're going to go up to Jerusalem, to Mount Zion, to get, you see there's a river of water of life. Verse 2, in the midst of the street of it, and of either side of the tree of the river was there the tree of life, which bare 12 manner of fruits, and yielded her fruit every month. So you've got water, and you've got fruit there in New Jerusalem. So you're in a country that doesn't have any water, doesn't have any food then because of that, because God cut off the rain because they didn't go up to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles. Well, what do you think you're going to do? You're going to do like Jacob and his sons did. They went up to Egypt where the food was. So people will go up to Mount Zion where the food is. And also notice, I didn't read the last part of verse 2. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. So they're sick because they don't have any food. So they go up to New Jerusalem. They have the water and they have fruit. And they eat leaves to heal them of whatever sicknesses they have. So it sounds like a pretty good place to go up to. So that was Revelation 22, 1 and 2. New Jerusalem there. So, in New Jerusalem, it's just like what we see, and we'll get to it in Revelation 21. It's just like people say walls of jasper, streets of gold, and all this stuff. But understand that outside of Jerusalem, it's a whole different picture. There is a lot of sin and a lot of rebellion. And, of course, Jesus keeps it from getting out of control. But you see the extreme measures he has to take. You got to go up to Jerusalem to hear the word of the Lord and to follow that, and you don't want to follow it, you don't go up there, I'm going to cut off your water. I mean, that's pretty serious what he has to do, but it shows what they have to do. So what ends up happening, go to Isaiah 65. What I think ends up happening, because you may also say, well, this is the millennial reign, the 1,000 years. But then after that, everything will be fine. Well, we'll get into that later. But I think, I'm going to tell you what I think is, I think what happens in the millennial reign, that cycle just continues to repeat itself for all eternity. So you got a millennial reign, then you have another millennial reign, then you have another millennial reign. And I'll get into that. But if you look in Isaiah 65 and verse 17, parallel to Revelation 21 verse 1, behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, and the former shall not be remembered nor come into mind. Verse 19, I will rejoice in Jerusalem, joy in my people. The voice of weeping shall be no more heard in her, nor the voice of crying. Now verse 20, there shall be no more thence an infant of days, nor an old man that hath not filled his days. For the child shall die 100 years old, but the sinner being 100 years old shall be accursed. So Isaiah 65 verse 20, child/sinner dies at age 100. Now, we normally think of a child being, at least by 21, they're no longer a child. Maybe you say 18, or in the Jewish tradition, I think it's age 12 that they're considered not to be a child anymore. But a child, the way you come up with that, if you look in Galatians chapter 4, is, our government tells us when somebody becomes an adult. But traditionally, what God says is that's not the case. It says in Galatians chapter 4 and verse 1, that the heir, as long as he is a child, so this is Galatians 4, 1 through 2. The heir, as long as he is a child, differeth nothing from a servant, though he be Lord of all, but is under tutors and governors until the time appointed of the father. So, when does a child become an adult? Child becomes adult when daddy says so. Which is good because, if you've had kids, some children, they say girls mature faster than boys, and I think it has to do with their sin nature, to where their sins are more subtle, so you don't really see it as much. And so that's why. It's not that they really mature quicker. But anyway, and our society is geared more toward women. Boys, they just want to go out and play and run around and throw the ball. They don't want to sit in a classroom and be still all this time. So it's a lot harder on boys that way. But anyway, you notice it says, according to God's word, a child becomes an adult at the time appointed of the father. So you may have a child and you say, well, I could treat him like an adult when he's 13. And you may have another child who's 25 and they still act like a child. So it's, if the father knows his own children, assuming you got a good family here where the father's actually around and raising them, then the father would have the wisdom to say when somebody is now an adult. And so what God does in his kingdom is, going back to Isaiah 65 verse 20, he says, okay, everybody, they're not going to live 70 or 80 years like people do today. They're going to live 1,000 years. And so then, instead of it being 18 years that you're a child, if you're living 1,000 years, I'll give you 100 years. You still have 900 years to be an adult if you're going to live 1,000 years. And so basically, what Isaiah 65 verse 20 is saying is that you have everybody when someone is born, they have a probation period of 100 years to where they can, they have the time to mature to see if they are going to follow Jesus with his rule of the rod of iron or not. And if they continue to rebel, they're going to be that sinner, and so then they are accursed at the 100 years. And so then what ends up happening is, so if they rebel, if they're the sinner thrown into hell. after 100 years. So God keeps the rebellion from getting really bad, but still 100 years is a long time. You say at least by age 20, you're doing good, and you can, you got 80 years there where you can just rebel, and He'll punish you, but He's not going to destroy you until you get to that 100-year period. So 80 years is a long time of an adult life to be able to rebel. And so you see, if you go to Isaiah 66, it says in verse 22, "For as the new heavens and the new earth which I will make shall remain before me, saith the Lord, so shall your seed and your name remain. And it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, saith the Lord. And they shall go forth and look upon the carcasses of the men that have transgressed against me, for their worm shall not die, neither shall their fire be quenched, and they shall be an abhorring unto all flesh." Jesus quotes this verse in Mark 9, 3 times actually, to show you that this is a reference to hell. So Isaiah 66:24 says, "Open shaft into hell." Maybe open shaft is the wrong word, because it's not like you could just fall in. Let's call it window. Window into hell in Jerusalem. So you've got to go up there to Jerusalem at least once a year to the Feast of Tabernacles, and you go to worship before the Lord, and what do you see? You see what happens in hell. So if you rebel, and you keep rebelling for all the 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, you get to age 100, and you know of this window into hell, and you see what happens to the people that rebel against Jesus and don't follow His rule, they end up in hell. That's a pretty good incentive for you to continue to obey, to at least obey on the surface. But then what ends up happening then, if you look in Revelation chapter 20, is that at the end of that first millennial reign there, Satan was in a bottomless pit for 1,000 years, and then he is loosed. Revelation 20 and verse 7, "When the 1,000 years are expired, Satan shall be loosed out of his prison, and shall go out to deceive the nations which are in the four quarters of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, the number of whom is as the sand of the sea." That's a lot. "And they went up on the breadth of the earth, and compassed the camp of the saints about, and the beloved city. And fire came down from God out of heaven, and devoured them." So you see in Revelation 20, 7 through 9, most Gentiles rebel in the end. They may stay around long enough to live after 100 years to keep serving God, Jesus, during the rod of iron rule for the next 900 years after that, but in their heart they really don't want to serve Him. They do it just so they're not killed, so they don't end up in hell. But then when Satan comes up, then they're thinking, oh, okay, well, maybe I won't have to go to hell, because Satan will overthrow this tyrant, Jesus, and he will rule, and so then I won't be under Jesus' rule, so let me side with Satan, and then I'll be on the side that wins. And so the vast majority of the people, because they don't like Jesus' rod of iron rule, they end up siding with Satan, and they end up being destroyed and cast into hell. So all of this, I hope, paints a picture for you to see that things just in the God's kingdom on earth, there is great rebellion. And I mentioned it continuing after the millennial reign. Now, is Satan at the end, is he cast into the bottomless pit for another 1,000 years, and then he's loosed 1,000 years, and does it just keep going on and on? I don't think so. I think Satan is cast out, because it says there in Revelation 20, when he's destroyed, it doesn't say he's cast into a bottomless pit again. It says in verse 10, "The devil that deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are, and shall be tormented day and night forever and ever." So it seems like after that first millennial reign, Satan is cast out, never to be a force again, never to be on this earth again. But I can see what ends up happening is there's another millennial reign after that, and there can be somebody on the earth that would organize a rebellion. I mean, look at what we've had. Hitler, Napoleon, you have these different people will rise up on occasion and try to become the world leader. The Antichrist will do it, before Jesus' second coming. So you can see that these nations, Jesus tries to break them in pieces and everything with a rod of iron, but you figure in 1,000 years, that's a long time to try to establish a rebellion against Jesus. So I could see somebody in the next 1,000-year period organizing a rebellion to come against Jesus. We don't really have Bible on that, so it's just a guess. But what we do know is a couple of things. Is it's not just a stagnant situation. If you look in Isaiah chapter 9, in Isaiah chapter 9 verse 7, unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. The government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there shall be no end upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom, to order it and to establish it with judgment and with justice from henceforth even forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. So Isaiah 9:7 says, Jesus' kingdom continually increases. And the way this happens then is there will be children that are born in that time. As eternity rolls on, you've got children being born. In Ezekiel 37, Ezekiel 37, talking about Israel united, the northern tribes and the southern tribes united together as one. Verse 24, David my servant shall be king over them. They shall have one shepherd. They shall also walk in my judgments and observe my statutes and do them. Now Ezekiel 37:25, they shall dwell in the land that I have given unto Jacob my servant, wherein your fathers have dwelt, and they shall dwell therein, even they and their children and their children's children forever. And my servant David shall be their prince forever. So you see, in the kingdom, Ezekiel 37:25, Jews have kids in the kingdom. Then, if you go over to Ezekiel 47 and verse 22, Ezekiel 47 and verse 22, and it shall come to pass that ye shall divide it by lot for an inheritance unto you, and to the strangers that sojourn among you. Strangers sojourning among Israel would be Gentiles. So Gentiles sojourn among you, which shall beget children among you, and they shall be unto you as born in the country among the children of Israel. They shall have inheritance with you among the tribes of Israel. So you see here that Gentiles have kids in kingdom. So they are going to be raised up. They have 100 years to have that child status. And then after 100 years, they're in rebellion. Well, then they're accursed. And remember, they see that every year going up to worship the Lord. They have a window into hell in Jerusalem to see how bad it is down there, that they don't want to go there. But most people are going to rebel because they want to do their own thing. Maybe they don't have Satan around to tempt them, but they still want to. They still would rather do what they want to do rather than what Jesus says to do. I mean, you look at the Levitical law, because they're going to follow the Mosaic law. You look at that stuff, can you imagine a nation doing that stuff today? They're killing animals left and right. You got meat offerings, drink offerings, peace offerings, sin offerings, trespass offerings, burnt offerings. You got all these different types of offerings. That's in addition to all the animals that are killed in the 7 feasts every year, and victories over enemies. They're killing animals left and right in there. And the reason is because it's to show your sin, that it's so serious, that it's your life. And God would say, I love animals, but I can always make more, and they don't live eternally. But man lives eternally. So I'd rather kill an animal and make more later And then that way, man will see the blood of the animal shed for his sin. And maybe he'll see that he needs to serve the Lord and not do the sin. I think we're so far removed from that as a nation today. Today, you can't even kill, you can't even wring a chicken's neck hardly in a city. You'd probably be arrested if you raised chickens in a city and tried to kill it and have it for lunch, even though millions of chickens are raised in these slaughterhouses and killed for dinners. But we're so far removed from that. Very few people actually see these animals being killed and eaten. I mean, you know what happens. I mean, you should be able to make the correlation here. I'm eating a piece of chicken. Where do you think I got that from? I'm eating a piece of ham. Where do you think that came from? It wasn't growing out of a plant on the ground. It was alive at one time. And that's probably why they're going to plant-based and vegetarianism, because all that's evil and everything. But really, you notice God has a lot of death in those Levitical laws. And things that they did. You can't wear tattoos. You can't wear a shirt with mixed fibers. You can't mar the corners of your beard. You got all these different rules. No one ever follows that stuff. But they're going to follow it in the kingdom, whether they like it or not. So then when they get their choice, probably what'll happen every 1,000 years or so, there will be somebody who organizes a rebellion to go against Jesus, and the people will say, yeah, I don't want to kill all those animals. They're poor defenseless things. I love those things. And so then they go up to Jerusalem and have a rebellion, and Jesus zaps them, and they go down to hell, and then they start over again with another 1,000 years. But then the ones who followed Jesus and didn't go in their rebellion, they're saved, they're added to the kingdom, and so his government continues to increase here. So that's what I think happens. Again, after the first millennial reign, we don't see that in Scripture where it says, well, there's going to be another one, then there's going to be another one. But that's just an educated guess, because we know his kingdom continues to increase. We know there are kids, there are sinners, children that die at age 100. So you got to figure that's just going to repeat itself throughout all eternity. And in heaven, the same thing will happen as well. And the kids are born not through sexual means, because there is no marriage. So you've got both male and female within you, so you can have your own baby, and it won't be any pain of childbirth, because pain of childbirth was added in Genesis 3 to the woman. That was part of the curse of sin. So when you, as the body of Christ, are in heavenly places, you will give birth to your own kids without sex, without marriage, and then you just have this kid, and you raise him in the things of God. And then it's up to him to decide after 100 years if he's going to rebel or not. Again, that's just an educated guess. But just based upon what we learned from Scripture in the millennial reign, we can extrapolate that out to continue on. It just seems like that's what's going to happen. Okay, we're almost an hour in, and I've only gotten through 3 verses. So now the rest of the psalm is going to go a lot quicker. You say, yeah, right, I've heard that before. Okay, so going back to Psalm 48, verse 3, God is known in our palaces for a refuge. So that's where I explain all this rebellion here. Verse 4, for lo, the kings were assembled, they passed by together. They saw it, and so they marveled, they were troubled, and hasted away. So that's what we just talked about. The kings of the earth, the Gentiles in the kingdom, Jesus ruling with a rod of iron on the throne in Jerusalem, and they assemble against him. They want to overthrow him, but they can't. And so you see the problem here. They're troubled because they cannot rule with over God, which is why when the 1,000 years is over, when Satan is loose, they're all for it, and the vast majority of the people follow Satan, and they're destroyed because they've been waiting. They couldn't overthrow Jesus, and when Satan is loose, they said, oh, here's the chance. Satan, somehow he must have power because he somehow got himself out of that bottomless pit. And so now, if he's got the power to do that, he's got the power to overthrow Jesus. And so all the rebellion is united with Satan to try to overthrow Jesus. And of course it doesn't work. So they troubled, they were hasted away. Verse 6, fear took hold upon them there, and pain as of a woman in travail. So I think this is a reference to, because if in verse 4 the kings were assembled, they passed by all together, I think that's a reference to that. final battle with Satan and his forces, or every 1,000 years the battle of whoever organizes the people to go against Jesus. So they saw it, they marveled, they were troubled, hasted away. So they're running away. So, oh no! You notice in Revelation 20, fire comes down from heaven to destroy them. So when they recognize they've united with Satan in a rebellion against Jesus at the end of the millennial reign, and then they recognize that, uh-oh, I picked the wrong side. Satan really doesn't have any power compared to God. And so they're troubled and they run away. And verse 6, fear took hold upon them there, and pain as of a woman in travail. So as they're running away, the fire, the pain, basically the fire comes down on them, and that's that pain of the woman in travail. So they're saying, oh, I'm going to get away, and yet they don't get away because the fire destroys them. Verse 7, thou breakest the ships of Tarshish with an east wind. So I think that tells you Satan's realm is the sea. So if he's breaking the ships of Tarshish, what I would say that means is basically those who are the merchants in Satan's economy. Basically, I shouldn't call it Satan's economy because we're talking about the millennial reign. Satan is in the bottomless pit. But those who try to come up with an economic power and make money to go against Jesus, basically their whole thing is broken up with an east wind. It shows you how easy, whenever man rebels against God, God allows it to build up to a certain point. It's just sort of like you think of, the big strong guy, right, with all the muscles and everything, and he's got like a 5-year-old, and the 5-year-old, you see this in the Looney Tune cartoons. I would see this growing up. And you got this little pipsqueak of a kid. He's saying, I'm going to fight you. I'm going to destroy you. And, the kid's just punching him in the knee or in the leg or something. And the guy just standing here and laughing, And you're not doing anything to him. He's just a little 5-year-old kid. This is the muscle guy, So you keep hitting him. Can't do anything. And then finally, when the guy tires out, the little pipsqueak kid tires out, then the big strong muscle guy just flicks him and he goes across the room, he's done. That's what I think of with God and Satan. Satan is like, I'm going to get you now, and he's just this little pipsqueak kid, and here's Jesus with all the big muscles, and he's just standing there, and he just lets him keep doing it. But when it comes to the time where, okay, no one else is going to be saved, and so he just flicks them away. And that's what he does at the end of the 1,000 years. Okay, you can come on out now. You got your rebellion. You got all these millions of people here, billions of people here. Okay, you ready to fight me? Yeah, let's go. Fire, you're destroyed, gone. That's what I see there. He just breaks up the ships of Tarshish. Fear comes upon them, and pain as a woman in travail. They try to run away. Too late, fire gets them. Verse 8, as we have heard, so have we seen in the city of the Lord of hosts, and the city of our God. God will establish it forever. Selah. Selah means pause. Think about that. We're talking about God's eternal kingdom. Man can't do that. The United States has been around 1776. So we're almost at 250 years now. We're at 248. That's about as long as a nation ever is. That's a long time. The great mighty nation, the U.S., it won't be long before it just crumbles. Man's kingdoms, they don't last that long. But God will establish His city forever. Washington, D.C., maybe there a long time, 200 years. That's nothing compared to eternity. New Jerusalem is going to stand forever. So that's the eternal kingdom there. Verse 9, we have thought of thy loving kindness, O God, in the midst of thy temple. So that's going back to verse 3. God is known in our palaces for a refuge. So here is believing Israel. They're in the temple, and they're in the kingdom on earth, and they think of God's loving kindnesses, that here's people that are in rebellious nations, and they can come in, they can get fruit from the tree of life, they can get water from the river of water of life, they can get leaves to heal them, that even though they continue to sin and do their own thing, God's loving kindness is there. They can freely come into Jerusalem and get the healing they need, get the nourishment they need. So believe in Israel there in verse 9, thinking of thy loving kindness, O God, in the midst of thy temple. Verse 10, according to thy name, O God, so is thy praise unto the ends of the earth. You're going to see a lot of this. We talk about Psalm 48, verse 10. Granted, you got God's people in New Jerusalem. Israel is under the new covenant, Jeremiah 31:31, Ezekiel 36:25, somewhere in there. They're under that new covenant. They always obey the Lord. They obey it perfectly. They go out as a kingdom of priests to the Gentiles. But a lot of those nations rebel, as we've seen. But yet there is going to be believing remnants. Believing remnants in every nation. So the nation as a whole may rebel. I mean, look at any of the wicked nations of today who don't recognize God, who don't follow His word, who haven't believed the gospel. You still have people in those nations that still trust in Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection as atonement for their sin. They still read their Bibles on a daily basis and actually believe what it says, rightly divided, using a King James Bible. We may be small, but there are actually people who do that. And so, according to thy name, O God, so is thy praise unto the ends of the earth. Thy right hand is full of righteousness. Thy right hand is Jesus. He is sitting at the right hand of the Father. He exhibits the righteousness of God because He has a body. And so He obeyed. He says, I come to do thy will, O God. He does God's will in His body. And so at the right hand of God, which is Jesus, is full of righteousness. So you got a believing remnant in every nation. And you look at Noah. You look at how bad the world got. Genesis 6 says, the thought of every man's heart was only evil continually. And yet after he destroys the earth, here's Noah. And he builds an altar unto the Lord. And he says, wow, this is so wonderful. Here is somebody who believes me. And so it's like it made it all worthwhile. I've heard women say that pain of childbirth is the worst thing you can experience. But somehow in the end, when that child is born, it's all worthwhile. I think that's how God is. Like the pains of childbirth is all the mess of the wickedness and evil it went through. And when it comes out the other side, here's somebody worshiping me. It's all worth it. And God in His foreknowledge knew that it wouldn't be long before He builds a vineyard. He gets drunk. Ham has sex with Noah. The stuff that happens there. God knew that would happen. But He's enjoying the moment of Christ living in Noah as He has that sacrifice there. And so that's, God says, yeah, you know what? I've got my king on the earth, and all these nations are still rebelling against me, but I got some believers in every nation. It's worth it. It's worth it. Thy right hand is full of righteousness. So right hand with righteousness equals a Jesus there. God's righteousness coming through Jesus and through some of those believers there in every nation. So it makes it all worthwhile. Verse 11, let Mount Zion rejoice. Let the daughters of Judah be glad because of thy judgment. So they're rejoicing. They're saying, hey, there's some believers out here. There's 10 men. We'll take hold of the skirt of the Jews. Saying, we'll go with you. We need God's house as a place of refuge from this nation that we're in here. So we'll go with you because God is with you. And so then verse 12, I want to spend a little time in verse 12. And this is where I told you at the beginning to place a marker in Revelation 21. And an hour later, we're actually going back to it. I didn't think it would take this long, but I never think that. So Psalm 48, verse 12 says, walk about Zion. Oh, we're not going to Revelation 21 yet. It's too soon. It's only been an hour you've been holding that, It says, walk about Zion. You know what's significant about that? That showing, this shows it belongs to God. That's the significance of it. Look in Job chapter 1. Job chapter 1. Boy, that marker almost fell. Phew, that was a close one. I know there's probably bets out there as how long it's going to take for his marker to fall down. Okay, anybody who had an hour and 4 minutes in, it didn't happen yet. You didn't win. Okay, Job chapter 1, verse 6. Satan and his devils have to present themselves before the Lord. Verse 7, Job 1:7, the Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou? Then Satan answered the Lord, said, From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. So Job 1:7. Job 2, go to Job 2. A little bit later, same scenario. Verse 2, the Lord said unto Satan, From whence comest thou? And Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. Job 2, verse 2. 1 Peter chapter 5. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8. Be sober, be vigilant. So this is 1 Peter 5, 8. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about, seeking whom he may devour. The idea of all these verses is when you walk about, it's basically saying, I own this. You know, I can do that for my land here that I own. I have about 1/4 of an acre. I can walk in the backyard. I can walk in the front yard. I can walk in the house. I own it. So I can walk all in this. I can't do whatever I want, but I can do pretty much anything. It's my land. So I can walk all around it. But there's a neighbor over here. There's a neighbor over there. I can't just go walking in their yard, walking in their house. I mean, they know who I am. I doubt they'd shoot me, but they'd say, Hey, Eric, what are you doing? You're lost? This is my house. This is my land. Why aren't you in your house, in your land? The idea is if I'm just walking about to and fro, walking up and down something, it's mine. I possess it. That's why when Joshua, couldn't think of his name, God had Israel under Joshua to go to Jericho. What do? They walk around the walls of Jericho. They walk around the walls of Jericho. We're going to get to the walls in a minute. Basically, they're saying, this is mine. I own it. You know, the people of Jericho are like, what are you doing? Well, the walls are going to come down. This is the best fortified city in the world. These walls aren't going to come down. And the Lord they do a shout, and the Lord sound the trumpets, and the Lord just has the walls fall down. The Lord does it for them. And so that's what you have here, the idea here. And Psalm 48, verse 12, walk about Zion, go round about her. Tell the towers thereof. Mark ye well her bulwarks. Consider her palaces, that ye may tell it to the generation following. Basically, walk around this. This is ours. It belongs to God. Walk about Zion, it belongs to God. And look at how big it is. You thought Jericho was big? Check out what bulwarks. Look at bulwarks. You know what bulwarks are? I didn't. I had to look it up, but it sounds like a military term. It's bulwarks are defensive walls. And if there's a rebellion in the kingdom, that's why you got defensive wall. Go over to Revelation 21. Look at how the city of Jerusalem is. How fortified it is. Jericho had high walls. I didn't look it up. I don't know how high the walls of Jericho were. But these walls of Jerusalem are higher than any other city has ever been. And verse 10, Revelation 21, verse 10, He carried me away in the Spirit to a great and high mountain, showed me that great city, the holy Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God, having the glory of God. I would think, I don't know, but I would think the city is on this mountain, so you got to get up to the mountain first. That's no small task. I've climbed mountains before. They're not easy. They get up. There's Mount San Gorgonio, the highest mountain in Southern California, 11,400 feet, I think. I've climbed to the top of that a couple of times. It was an 8-mile hike. I started at elevation about 5,000, so I had to climb about 6,000 feet to get to the top of this thing. It wasn't easy. So you get up to the top of that mountain, and then at the top, then you finally get there. You're already exhausted is the point, because you get up there, and now there's a great city, the Holy Jerusalem. You see in verse 12, it had a wall great and high, and had 12 gates, and at the gates 12 angels, and names written thereon, which are the names of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel. Look in verse 14. The wall of the city had 12 foundations, and then the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. It says in verse 16, the city lieth foursquare, the length is as large. That's where the foursquare Pentecostal denomination comes from, by the way. City lieth foursquare, and the length is as large as the breadth. And he measured the city with the reed, 12,000 furlongs. The length and the breadth and the height of it are equal. Revelation 21:16. Length, width, is that what it says? Or it says breadth, doesn't it? Say breadth. Length, breadth, and height are equal. It is 12,000 furlongs. A furlong, there are 8 furlongs to a mile. So that means this is 1,500 miles. That's how big the city is. Remember that this is an eternal kingdom, and the government's going to increase with time. We don't have any city that comes close to that. I don't know how big New York or Los Angeles is. When I was in Los Angeles, in that area, lived in there, maybe the whole city stretches out. If you go all the way into Orange County and all that area, maybe 40, 50 miles. And that's probably the biggest sprawled out city in the U.S., I would guess. Maybe in the world, I don't know. 40 or 50 miles. We're talking about 1,500 miles here. 1,500 miles is from Mexico to Canada on the west coast, almost that entire length. Not quite. It's more than 1,500 miles from Mexico to Canada on the west coast. But it's pretty close. It's pretty close to. So think of 1,500 miles. It's almost the height of California, Oregon, and Washington together. Almost. Not quite, but almost. 1,500 miles long would be about 2/3 of the U.S. So you could go from California to about, I don't know, Missouri maybe? It'd be about 1,500 miles. So just think of that whole area there, from California to Missouri, from California to Washington, all across. We're just talking about a city. We're not talking about a nation. We're talking about the city, New Jerusalem. That's where all the believers are. That's their home. And not only that, but it's also 1,500 miles high. That right there, the 1,500 miles high, adds a whole other level. Because now you got different stories. You think of stories, like at the beach, they got condos and they go up maybe 25 stories. The Empire State Building is what, 150 stories? So what a plane, think of a plane. A plane will travel, at the highest, maybe it goes to 35,000 feet. That's maybe 7 miles in the air. 7 miles, okay, multiply that by what? 220? And there's your 1,500 miles. So think of where that plane is. The high plane way up there, multiply it by about 220 and go up 220 times that. That's how high this city is going to be. And you can have stories and you can have levels. And you don't have to worry about gravity, I don't think, in the New Jerusalem, because they'll have their glorified bodies. At least Israel will, so they can go up as high as they want. It's not like having to take an elevator. You could fly up there. At least those with the new bodies, the glorified bodies. So the point is, it's a huge city. Now, of course, the Gentiles, not under that new covenant, don't have the glorified bodies. Maybe they will after the 1,000 years, and the next one, then they can be part of that city, and then it can grow. So then it keeps going up. I think the covenant that God makes with Gentiles at the end of the millennial reign is the same covenant he made with Israel at the second coming. And so then I think they get their glorified bodies, they join New Jerusalem. And so as 1,000-year periods go on, more and more people, believing remnants of every nation, end up joining and being part of New Jerusalem. And now they have the glorified bodies where they can fly up 1,500 miles if they need to. And so as it goes on forever and ever, that's why you need such a large space. We don't have anything that even approaches this. We can't even understand it. But of course, those who are outside don't have the glorified bodies, so they're subject to gravity. So for them, there's a wall built, and the wall is very high. If you go down to verse 17, the next verse. Now we see about the wall. You think Trump wants to build a big wall? This is a lot bigger than that. He measured the wall thereof. Now, of course, the wall then would be for those who don't have the glorified bodies. They're in the kingdom, but they're Gentiles. They haven't under the new covenant, so they can't fly. So they're subject to gravity. He measured the wall thereof 144 cubits, according to the measure of a man, that is, of the angel. That, by the way, tells you that an angel is like a man with no wings. They can't fly. So that's important because they can't fly either, these men. So 144 cubits. A cubit, the profane cubit is 18 inches. The sacred cubit, I think, is 20 or 21 inches. So let's take the smallest measure of the cubit, 144 cubits times a foot and a half. That equals 200, the walls are 216 feet high, at minimum. So I tried to figure out, okay, to give us an idea of really how high that is, because none of us go that high. How high is 216 feet? The Statue of Liberty is 305 feet high. So not quite as high. Over 2/3 the height of the Statue of Liberty. Maybe 3/4 of the height of the Statue of Liberty. Yeah, about 3/4. Not quite, but close. So 70%. Probably 70% of the height of the Statue of Liberty is how high these walls are. That's pretty high walls. You think you're going to get over them? And of course, you got to remember that people with the glorified bodies on the inside can fly. So if someone tries to build something to get up there, because they got to fight gravity, but the people in New Jerusalem don't because they have their glorified bodies. So it'd be very easy to stop people that try to come over the wall. So that's a lot higher than the wall Trump wants to build, and a lot harder to get over too. And the building of the wall, verse 18, is of jasper. The city was pure gold, like unto clear glass. The foundations of the wall of the city were garnished with all manner of precious stones, and it gives you the 12 listed there. 12 gates in verse 21 have the 12 pearls. So the street of the city was pure gold, as it were transparent glass. So it's not just like what Trump wants to build, some kind of concrete wall, I guess. Whatever wall he builds, it's not going to be 216 feet high, and it's not going to be beautiful. It's just there to keep people out, or later on, when communism takes hold of the U.S., to keep people in. But just like the Berlin Wall, that will be the ultimate use of that wall. But anyway, if the Lord tarries until that time, and if the wall is built. But these walls here for New Jerusalem are a lot prettier. Walls of jasper. Foundations of the wall have 12 different stones. There are 12 gates, and they're gates of pearl. This is a much more beautiful thing than some concrete wall that Trump wants to build. So it's not an ugly thing just to keep people out. It's a beautiful thing. This is going to be a sight to behold. I mean, it's on a city. It's on a city. The city is on a mountain, great and high. So it's going to be higher than Mount Everest for sure. I talked about getting up San Gorgonio. That was an 8-mile walk, climbing 6,000 feet. Okay, going up to Jerusalem? A lot higher? Now, maybe, I would think if you're doing that for the Lord, He'll make sure you get there. It won't be as hard as climbing Mount San Gorgonio, but it's a high mountain, okay? And the wall, 216 feet high. And the city, 1,500 miles high. It's just a huge thing. And I don't think God will allow planes and all this internet and technology that we have. Satan in Ephesians 2:2 is the prince of the power of the air. And since he's cast out, they're not going to have that. That's why you have like swords beat their swords into plowshares or spears into pruning hooks. It doesn't talk about submachine guns or Patriot missiles, Scud missiles, nuclear bombs. The technology is pretty primitive. Well, I think because Satan is the one who builds all that technology stuff, although it can be used for the Lord. Primarily, Satan is the one who uses it for his kingdom. And that's all going to be destroyed, so the technology stuff is going to be gone. So how are you going to get over a 216-foot wall? You can't fly in. And I think all that technology is gone. So now, one thing also I wanted to mention. So the wall is 216 feet high. So I looked it up. I was trying to find out. Well, if you Google 216 feet high, in 2022, there was a Statue of Equality. Statue of Equality built in India. And it is a statue of a person. I'm going to write the name up here. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce it. This is someone who lived over 1,000 years ago in the Indian religion. Saint R.A.M. A.N.U.J. A.C.H.A.R.Y.A. Saint R-A-M-A-N-U-J-A-C-H-A-R-Y-A. If you don't get that from the board and you want it, just type in 216-foot high statue or Statue of Equality, and that will be it. So this is supposed to be the equality and going against all the social injustices of the world. You think it's a coincidence that the Statue of Equality in India to this saint guy is 216 feet high, the exact same height as the walls of New Jerusalem? There's no way that's a coincidence. Why would you make it 216 feet high? Because that's what God made it. Maybe this is a little higher, if the cubit's a little higher than 18 inches, but I would assume Satan is just using the 18-inch marker and getting them to build this exactly the same height as the walls of New Jerusalem. Okay, now going back to Psalm 18. Psalm 18, verse 12. Walk about Zion, go round about her, tell the towers thereof. Mark ye well her bulwarks, consider her palaces, that ye may tell it to the generation following. The generation following, then, is what we talked about up here. That the Jews have kids in the kingdom, that the Gentiles have kids in the kingdom, and so generation following goes along with that in, where are we? Psalm 48:13. So, kids today, they're told these fictitious stories that are probably from satanic realms, and they try to get them all excited about wizards and warlocks and princes and all this stuff that this satanic stuff they build up. Well, when you have kids and you're in these Gentile nations, you could tell them about the great city of New Jerusalem, and it's not a fairy tale. And so they get to tell it, so you say, Mark it, go around the Zion, the towers, the bulwarks, consider the palaces. So you can go tell your kids about this when you have kids. Verse 14, for this God is our God forever and ever. He will be our guide even unto death. Okay, that seems like a really weird way of concluding this. We're talking about God's eternal kingdom. And it says God is our God forever and ever. That's eternal. But what's this God, our guide even unto death? Well, I think what it is I think Psalm 48, and I don't want to erase. I think Psalm 48, 1 through 13 is talking about New Jerusalem, God's eternal kingdom on earth. And it is written, if you go to the introduction of Psalm 48, a song and psalm for the sons of Korah. The sons of Korah were Levites. They're part of the Levitical tribe. So I think what it's doing is in verse 14, it's just basically, I think Psalm 48 verse 14 is written this is instruction to Israel before the kingdom. Because this was written, what, 2,500 years ago at least? Maybe closer to 3,000 years ago when this was written. And kingdom hasn't happened yet. Israel still hasn't become God's people. So, at least spiritually speaking. So, I think it's just saying, verse 14 is basically saying, we're talking in first 13 verses about God's eternal kingdom, what it's going to be like, Mount Zion. And then it's just a concluding verse for all those people reading it before it gets to that point. For this God is our God forever and ever. So don't follow the Antichrist. Don't follow whatever rebellion there is. Worship this God. This God is forever and ever. And He will be our guide even unto death. And I think the even unto death, I think of image of the beast there. There will be an image of the beast. If they don't bow to it in the last half of the tribulation period, their heads are cut off. And so it's trying to say to them, even keep this in mind. You know, if you're going through that time and you're running for your life and you don't have food because you won't take the mark or worship the image, Psalm 48 can be a great encouragement to you. That God puts down the rebellion. That God will rule forever. And He will be your God. And He will stay with you even unto death. Even unto that time when your neck is cut, when your head is cut off. Because you won't bow down to the image of the beast. He will guide you even to the... He even tells His disciples, we look over in Mark, if I can find it, Mark 13 maybe? Mark 13 verse 11. When they shall lead you, Mark 13, 11. I'll just write that down here. Mark 13 verse 11. When they shall lead you and deliver you up, take no thought beforehand what ye shall speak, neither do ye premeditate. But whatsoever shall be given you in that hour, that speak ye. For it is not ye that speak, but the Holy Ghost. Saying, in that hour, when they take you up, when they've arrested you because you wouldn't bow down to the image of the beast. Don't think about what you're going to speak. The Holy Ghost is going to speak through you. And He's going to get people saved as a result of this. So God is going to be our guide even unto death. Even as we're going to have our heads cut off, God is going to give you the words to get Israel saved so they can be part of this glorious eternal kingdom that's talked about in the first 13 verses of Psalm 48. All right. See, the last part did go faster, but we still went almost an hour and a half. All right, that was Psalm 48. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.